A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps, because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. Well, as I said earlier, that I'm going to be turning the meeting over to Roger. He's going to take the lead tonight, and Herb and I will jump in and discuss some of the ideas that Roger talks about tonight. So, Raj, welcome.
Thank you, Alan. Hello, Herb, and good evening, or whatever time of day it is in your part of the world, to everybody. Thank you, Alan. I really appreciate, as always, the chance to take the lead tonight, or to take part in our discussions about emotional sobriety. As we said last week, to me, with this chapter, we're really getting into the core, the center of our subject matter. Obviously, if you've been with us for a long time, you've heard us talk about emotional sobriety from a lot of different angles. Tonight, I want to say a few introductory comments, but then I want to get to a more, okay, we're learning that we need to learn a lot of things, how to take the behavior of other people less personally, how not to be so emotionally dependent, how to be more differentiated, more autonomous in our functioning, on and on and on. But tonight I want to focus on, okay, that's great, but how, right? How do I take these concepts and these ideas and work with them in a way where I begin to build them into my life? Alan introduced this idea because, after all, as he said then, this is a workshop, with a few incomplete sentences that he asked you to do a few weeks ago. And as he did then, I want to do now. I would like for you all to get a pen and paper if you don't have one close. Those of you who want to, who would like to do this. Or if your keyboard is close by, you can do it there as well, of course. So, first of all, I want you to write my level of emotional sobriety. My level of emotional sobriety. And by that, I mean just kind of a general perspective at this point in your life of your level of emotional sobriety. And then on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being I have no emotional sobriety whatsoever, and 10 being I could not possibly have more emotional sobriety in my life and in my functioning and in how I feel. Pick a number that approximates your sense of where your emotional sobriety is at this point in your life. I urge you to go with kind of your first impression, like we encourage you to do with the endings to the incomplete sentences. Next, I want you to write down your level of self-esteem. My level of self-esteem, as you've heard us talk about it at this meeting. And again, on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 is I don't feel like I have any self-respect and self-confidence at all, which again are the two major components, as Nathaniel Branden at least writes about them, of self-esteem. Or 10 would be like, I couldn't possibly have a higher level of self-respect, self-confidence, self-acceptance. 0 to 10. Okay. And now I'm going to ask you to do a few of the incomplete sentences that we talked about. The root of the sentence that I want you to write 2 or 3 endings to, when we're working with our clients and having them do these in writing, what Nathaniel Branden recommends is write 6 to 10 endings. Now remember, the endings are intended to be spontaneous, so don't sit there and study, I've got to write something that sounds really brilliant or deeply true or really wise. Just whatever comes to mind, a short grammatical ending to the sentence. One way my emotional dependency shows up in my life is, that's the stem or the root that I want you to work with. One way my emotional dependency shows up in my life is. And after you write those words, complete the sentence, write the first words that come to mind, just a few words, not another whole sentence. And then move down on your paper a little bit and write a second different ending. You don't have to write the root again, but write a second different ending. One way my emotional dependency shows up in my life is, and then write a third. Short grammatical completion to the sentence. If nothing's coming, just write that. Nothing's coming. Blank. The next sentence is, I'm afraid if I give up some of my dependencies, I might. I'm afraid if I give up some of my dependencies, I might. Write one ending, then write a second, whatever comes to mind, then a third. Next sentence. A rule I have for how others must treat me is. So here I'm asking you that spontaneously, whatever comes. The best endings are the ones that surprise you, right? A rule I have for how others must treat me is. Write 3 different endings to that sentence. And the final one is, one of the ways I support myself emotionally. So we're looking at the other side of it now, self-support. One of the ways I support myself emotionally is, and try to be specific, is I, try to meet my responsibilities. Well, that's a great ending. Any ending is acceptable, any ending. But for this one in particular, one way I try to support myself is when I kept my word with such and such person the other day, when I didn't want to, when it was embarrassing to me, or something like that. So set those aside for now. A couple of points that Alan talks about in this chapter, which is about becoming aware of and taking ownership of how our emotional dependencies function in our lives, how they show up. One of them he talked about that I just want to summarize a couple of. One is when we're coming from a deeply emotionally dependent position, which again is just how we learn to cope growing up, Doesn't mean we're bad people. It doesn't mean anything faintly related to that. It just means this is the best that I could figure out to do. When our dependency needs, our need for acceptance and love and belonging are the three that Alan focuses on. And certainly there's three very, very deep needs. When they aren't met, it leaves a whole lot of unmet need inside of us. And some of us respond to that by feeling it keenly throughout the rest of our lives. We're very reactive to perceived rejection. We find it very difficult to support ourselves emotionally, and so on. Others of us decide we're not going to feel that way. So we either, as Alan said in one of the three coping styles that Karen Horney talked about, we resign ourselves to never having our needs met. So we act like we are wantless and needless. Or we go the other direction, a different direction, I should say. We strive for mastery. We want to be in control of everything. Or we're self-effacing. We erase ourselves all the time. We behave like martyrs in our lives. But we all are doing the best we can each step of the way. When we do that, we become extremely self-focused and self-centered because we don't know how else to be. And other people tend to become means to our ends. So as Alan points out in this chapter, we might be very focused on other people, but we're only focused on them in terms of how they can meet our needs, right? What they can do for us. So it's not a genuine concern with the well-being of the other person. So our relationships become really complicated in that way. And as you've heard us talk about a lot, we want to get what we need. So then we begin to become controlling and manipulative, consciously or not, often not. And in come the unenforceable rules and so on, the expectations and demands. So our emotional dependencies have a deep and abiding impact on our relationships with others. So what can we try to do about that? Well, Alan's going to talk with us in the coming meeting about his emotional sobriety inventory. And in the columns of that inventory, the fifth column, the final column, he talks about what actions we may need to take. And to me, that very much includes internal actions we may need to take within our own mind to better support ourselves, to feel our sense of autonomy more clearly and in a way that's more real to us. So there he's talking about change after the awareness needed is built in the first four steps. Tonight, I want to talk about change generally and then give some specific examples. Change is not easy. And it's for a couple of different reasons. One is the patterns that we have are deeply established normally in our lives. We've been doing our pattern, whether it's moving toward mastery, whether it's moving toward being self-effacing and never considering ourselves, whether it's the resignation solution. Some other ways that Alan talks about styles of coping that we have that are similar to those three, but not quite identical. Our three of our coping styles are the, moving toward somebody in the sense of trying to appease them or please them or gain their approval, or the aggressive response, the chip on our shoulder response, moving against other people. Right? And then the third is moving away from, withdrawing. And those are parallel to the, fight and flight and appeasing response that we've talked about before as well. So there are different ways, and a lot of those terms are actually quite similar. It's different styles we develop, and we're all hybrids of those styles. One of them will often be predominant for us. So part of change is recognizing what our own style is. As Alan said, before we can really begin to make progress with our emotional dependencies, we need to become aware of what they are. Well, part of that is becoming aware of what our coping style is. And as we develop awareness of our coping style, it's really important to be aware of individual differences. And as I talk for a few more minutes tonight, it's really important to be aware of individual differences. Because I might make a suggestion about change that might fit wonderfully for one of you and horribly for another of you. If I talk about learning how to, put your energy out into the world more and express yourself more readily, and you're already a person who's way overbalanced in the direction of focusing on other people and the world, that's not the greatest direction to give you, right? That's not the greatest advice. On the other hand, the opposite advice would not be fitting for somebody with the opposite tendency. So this is where knowing your own tendencies, your own patterns is so important. And it's also where always chewing over ideas, whether it's something you read, whether it's something you hear or you're told, whether it's something you think of yourself. Always chew concepts and ideas over for yourself. Digest them. See how well you think they fit for you. So a couple of major obstacles to change. And I'm talking about change in general, but even though our focus here is on changing regarding our emotional sobriety and our emotional dependency. This first one might seem strange, but we refer to it when we talk about that paradoxical theory of change in Gestalt psychotherapy, that a powerful modality of change is becoming more accepting of what we are doing, more willing to take ownership of what we are doing, more willing to talk about and disclose what we are doing. One of the obstacles to change is trying too hard to change, making too much effort. And what do I mean by that? Well, for those of you in 12-step programs, you know what I'm talking about. We're talking about it as white knuckling, right? Just trying to do everything with willpower, trying to do everything with fierce determination. And our sheer effortfulness in trying to make changes in our lives, whether it's in recovery or in life more generally, can really get in the way because we don't take time to become aware of what's going on within us and what's going on between us, between ourselves and other people. We do need to exercise some effort and some willingness. We need to be willing to put ourselves into situations that we would like to be able to make progress with, that reflect something we want. But if we're too determined to use willpower to create change, we tend to run out of steam after a while. So yes, we do need to be willing to evoke some anxiety, to put ourselves in situations that scare us some, not overwhelmingly so. Plus, it works against the direction of self-acceptance, right? This whole overcoming kind of energy, adversarial relationship to myself kind of energy can easily be reflected in that kind of excessive effortfulness. A second obstacle is self-judgment. And again, If we think of change often as happening in 3 steps: awareness, acceptance, and then new behavior or new attitude or both. Judgment blows that acceptance piece out of the water, right? And to the extent we feel judgmental or critical or shameful about our behavior, it becomes a huge obstacle to change. As you've heard us say many times, we're not able to change things that we're not able to experience and be deeply aware of. Few things can prevent awareness as thoroughly as strong self-judgment and shame can do. So when we notice that going on, what we try to do is bring attention and awareness to the shame and to the self-judgment and bring it out into the open. Like Carl Rogers, the famous psychotherapist, talks about, what I am is good enough if I would only be it openly. Again, that doesn't mean all situations, all contexts, and so on. But if we feel safe enough and we're in an environment where we feel it's appropriate to bring what we're feeling and thinking out. So those 2 things, well, let me add one more. It's not just difficult to change because we're so deeply conditioned and those neural pathways in our brain are so grooved. But a huge piece of why change is so difficult is because we come up against all the reasons that we formed our patterns in the first place. And part of us is screaming, no, 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 don't do that. Don't change. If you change, we're never going to get the love we hope for. If we change, we're going to get lots of negative things that we don't want. Don't say that. Don't feel that. Don't do that. Don't take a risk. Don't express yourself. Somebody might not like it. On and on and on. So any movement toward change brings us right up against all of our prohibitions. And that part of us creating those prohibitions thinks it's looking out for us, like you've heard us say many times, thinks it's protecting us. That's a huge piece of what gets in the way. So again, a way to work with that is just to talk about that experience and what our fears are, to meet ourselves where we are rather than where we think we should be. So now I'm going to take it a step further, talking about specific changes. I want you to think about a specific action or 2 that you could take in your life. By action, I mean, the most obvious meaning is observable behavior, right? Doing something that an observer could see you do. I also can extend that to include mental action, right? Changes in our attitudes, changes in our beliefs. Those are hugely important as well. But at least one of them, making it an observable behavior that would help you, feel a greater sense of autonomy and self-support, feel less emotionally dependent. I could set it up for myself to tell somebody what I would like 3 times this week. Or if my pattern is I'm always telling people what I like, and they better comply with what I want or what I like, I'm going to try this week to ask somebody what they would like. Okay? I'm going to try something different, not something that evokes a high level of anxiety, but mild to at most moderate anxiety. So what kind of things do you think about when you're asking this? Well, I encourage people to think about 2 or 3 different things. The first thing I think about is, what do I want? Most of us, a lot of us, often don't know what we want. Or, like I say, another pattern is we know what we want, but we don't have the slightest concern with what the other person wants. Neither style tends to work very well. So that's the first thing. How do we know what we want? We ask ourselves, what do I like? What do I don't like? What do, you know, what do I enjoy? What do I not enjoy? What helps me feel better? What doesn't help me feel better? So that's where I start. What do I want? Then the second part is, why should I take any action to change this? What's my motivation? Why do I want this? Other than a sense of I kind of like it or I want it, why do I want to go through any anxiety to make any kind of change? And there the answers are as different as we are as human beings. It might be because I'm becoming aware of the pain associated with my existing pattern for myself in my life. It might be because I want to move toward increased sense of self-support and autonomy and self-confidence and self-respect, integrity, self-acceptance. In general, we can divide it up into, moving away from pain and other fear and other negatives in our life towards something more positive, or just moving toward something that we want to build into our experience more in our life. So that's the next thing I ask is, why do I want this? And this is really important. Is this idea in my head, I have in my head, even the thing I ask you to think about, is this a should or is this a want? Because very often in the grips of our false self and our emotional dependency, we come from our shoulds without realizing their shoulds. So it's worth reflecting on that. Another thing I encourage my clients to ask themselves, and I ask myself, is any part of me objecting to this change? And what specific fears or objections does it have? I kind of like to get a heads up about that, because otherwise they're going to show up in procrastination and forgetting and everything, every way I can have of never getting around to it, right? I know that you used to talk about that in a form of therapy called transactional analysis. They wrote the words "to it" and they put a big circle around it, right? If I ever get around to it, and most of us have a lot of around to it's, right? But that's a way that when we're in conflict, that's a way our conflict, it's not laziness, it's nothing to do with any of that. It's just conflict. It's those fears I mentioned about, wow, I'm afraid if I do this, this might happen. Not sure I'm ready for that. So think about the one or two things you wrote down. And in light of these aspects of it, I asked you to look at, see if there's a commitment you'd like to make to yourself. Again, small steps. You've heard me talk about it several times. Small steps. Something that you might feel a little anxiety about or resistance to. We often use that word, resistance. Again, it's just conflict. It's just another part of us. And give yourself that, goal for yourself. Give yourself that goal. Run it by any objections. Modify it. A specific behavior you'd like to engage in that would help move you toward reduced emotional dependency, increased emotional sobriety. We set small goals. Then we check in with ourselves at the end of the day, if it's a goal we wanted to do that day, or the end of the week, and we assess. Did I do it? Did I not do it? Did I forget about it? Did I do part of it? And we reflect on that a little bit. Wow, wonder what happened there. I'm going to ask the part of me that didn't do it. And I'll actually write the sentence down. The part of me that didn't do it wants to say, okay, and I'll listen. And then I might revise the goal, or if I did it, I'll acknowledge that, and then I'll think about an additional one that I can then add. But if we can start with small goals and we can enact them in our behavior, and we're able to do it, we create an experience of success. That helps us do the next one and find the courage to do the next one. We may need to revise our goal. We may be bit off more than we could chew, or maybe our anxiety was greater than we thought it would be. That's fine. That's how we learn. That's how we learn. So we try something, we see what happens, we try again, either the same or we modify it, maybe scale it down a little bit. So, as always, there's more to talk about, certainly about the subject of change. There's a lot more to talk about, but I hope some of these ideas are helpful to many of you. I hope they're helpful to all of you. Not being able to change often has nothing whatsoever to do with how deeply we want to change. But it's simply that we have certain ideas about how to change. I'll finish with one story. Milton Erickson, a therapist I like a lot, when he was a child, he grew up on a farm. And his dad was trying to get the mule that they had pull the plow out of the barn. And the mule, true to their reputation, was being very stubborn. And it wouldn't budge. The dad was pulling it, yelling at it, you know. And I don't know how old Erickson was. I think he was 10 or 12. But something came to him and he said, "Dad, do you mind if I try something?" And the dad wasn't getting it. So Erickson went around and he started pulling hard on the tail of the mule. Because what the mule was into was opposition, right? Resistance. And sure enough, the mule walked out the barn door. And once he was hooked up to the plow, he just did what he was used to doing. But we don't understand that when we're in the grips of a severe conflict, just trying to force our way through it and use willpower only tends to intensify the conflict, to tighten the binds that we're in. Taking a breath and trying to look at both parts of the conflict and try a different path to change is very often what's needed, rather than trying harder at the same path we're trying. So thank you all very much for your attention tonight. And I'll bring Alan and Herb back in.
Well, Herb, let me defer to you first, and then I'll take it.
All right, wonderful. Thanks. I made 3 pages of notes. Thank you again. Lots of things to think about, and I saw them falling into some of the models and structures that we've used before, especially where you started with the fight, flight, and freeze instincts. And that the story of the mule is that paradoxical change that you talk about. And it's like the step one, the moment that you breathe in and accept that you really are not going to be able to do this on your own, whatever the vocabulary is, the moment you accept that I can't do this on my own, I can't change on my own, that's the moment that the change begins to be available anyway. And there's an acronym in the program coming out of the appendix 2 in the back of the big book where it says willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness. Well, they switched the words around to make it an acronym: honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. How does change happen? Honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. This is the key and indispensable to the kind of change. Now, I knew this stuff, I heard it all, mouthed it all, But until this man did this, and you've seen me do it before, Herb, you got all this information, but you have very little transformation. And then he introduced me to literally a prayer practice, which is just the mechanism of making me more sort of committed to a consciousness of open mind and open heart. No, I don't know enough. No, I don't have enough willpower. No, I don't have enough energy. No, I don't have enough whatever it is going to take on my own, because I don't know that I don't know. And I began to experience that, especially with his gesture. I mean, it was so visceral, that I adopted that sort of willingness. I didn't even know what it meant, had no experience with it. But I said, I'm going to accept that without any credibility, without any experience, without any emotion. But there was something that connected me to the truth of it. And as I began then listening with that open mind and open heart and taking actions that I'd never taken before. So this is so, there's a lot of moving parts. And you mentioned the conditioning that comes from the outside culture and from the inside, our own biology, you mentioned, and the differences of fight, flight, and freeze. People who are not familiar with perhaps the Enneagram might check that out, because that was my first encounter with, oh, people are not better than or worse than. I'm not better than or worse than. People are just different.
Yeah.
And it's structural. It's not moral. It's not even willpower. It's structural, it's biology, it's physiology. Now, everybody has everything, but we all have, and you used a wonderful word. It was somewhat of like we have the priority default coping strategy. And each one of us has one, even though we have everything. And the moment I heard and experienced that and kind of understood it was the moment that I could look straight out at people level, looking them in the eye and have them look me in the eye, because we're just different. So thank you.
Thank you, Herb.
Yeah. I think every week you've had 3 pages of notes, Herb.
Yeah, well, it is true. No, I have a binder. That is correct.
Great. That's wonderful. And people are echoing that in the chat. They're taking 3 pages of notes too. That's cool. You know, what I was going to say, Raj, is that, you know, in this emotional dependency thing, we've got to think about our definition of success.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we make success an external validation of our effort, then we're right back to taking a dirty shoe off one foot and putting it on the other one. And we got to be real careful of this, because we want a different definition of success. You know, success isn't that you're going to do something and it's going to work out the way you want it to all the time. Success, you know, in terms of emotional sobriety would mean something more like, I'm going to try it and I'm going to learn from the experience and what the experience has to teach me, regardless of the outcome. Yeah. See, what we want to do is we want to create a consciousness of freedom. That's the goal here, right? That's what we're striving for. So we need to continue to think of what path do I have to take? One path that's not going to lead to that freedom is a path that involves contingencies, right? That if I do this, then this is going to happen. Then if I do this, then I'm going to get that. We got to avoid that when we make our behavior contingent on the outcome, then we're right back into that dependency and we're being controlled by the outcome. So what we want to do is unhook that. We want to unhook ourselves from that kind of thinking. And what we're trying to do is to develop a consciousness that says, I'm going to go ahead and try something new. This experimental attitude of trying something new is so important in terms of emotional sobriety, because it's the only way we're going to discover a new possibility. Right? That's exactly what we're looking for. We talk about it all the time, is that recovery is the discovery of new possibilities in our life. And so to discover those new possibilities means we have to experiment. We have to try things on, especially trying things on, as you said, Roger, that are going to be uncomfortable, that are going to be different than what we've done before, that are going to feel unnatural, because if you're doing something habitually for a long time, like if you put your shirt on by putting your right hand through first and then your left, tomorrow try to put your left hand in first. It's going to take a real conscious effort to pull that off. You can, but you're going to have to really bring your awareness and your intention to that task at hand. So that's the thing I just want to, emphasize here, is we're developing a consciousness of freedom. So be careful. Success doesn't mean doing it and then things turning out the way that you want them to. Success means doing it and things turn out some way, and we learn from it and we develop wisdom.
And the best way to reinforce that in a conversation with somebody is to ask them questions about what they mean by what they're saying.
That's right.
I mean, that's so profound about that the awareness that you were talking about. Oh no, success.
Yeah.
What does success mean? Or what does emotional sobriety mean? Or what does acceptance mean?
I had a couple today that I was talking to about empathy, and I asked them both what empathy means, and they had very different definitions of what empathy means. And so, if they're operating with different definitions and understanding, one person could think they're being incredibly empathic when the other person says, where's the empathy? I mean, so, you're right, Herb. We really got to investigate that. And look, the final thing I would just say, all of this requires a high degree of curiosity, is to continue to be curious about yourself, about life, about emotional sobriety. And if you do that, you'll be well on your way.
And I couldn't have done any of this without the teachers in my life. I mean, different times and different kinds of qualities, but everything I have is because I encountered a wisdom person of some kind.
Exactly. And that's what we talk about, is that enlightened witness, that we all need that.
Yeah.
We're not going to do this alone. And that's why this workshop, I think, is so valuable to so many people, including me. When I get to sit here and listen to you guys talk, I learn something each and every time.
But it's so true. Don't think that emotional autonomy and growing in our emotional sobriety means, separating ourselves more from other people. It's not what we're talking about. It was one of the things in the process of change that I didn't have a chance to get to. Other people, whether it's a mentor, you talk about a mentor, Herb, or a spiritual advisor, or a sponsor, a teacher, a consultant and coach, all of it.
That's why I use the term wisdom person, right?
Yeah, can be incredibly powerful allies in our movement toward increased autonomy. It sounds contradictory, but trust us, it's not.
And the two words that Alan used are foundational words. That consciousness was, in fact, the conversation we've been having up to this point, and was one of the pillars of the self-esteem. That's the awareness, and that's a synonym for it, that we absolutely have to foster. Otherwise, we have this natural tendency to go to sleep. So it's like on almost a daily basis, not like it's work, but it's like we pay attention to that. And then keep in mind the goal. Lots of people lose track of why they're doing whatever they're doing. And the other word was freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the word agency that you've used before, both of you, is that personal freedom.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see, that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.